to this week's show. This week I've got an old painting. It's on wood and it's from about 4 years ago. I painted it when I was kind of interested in Rembrandt, so you can kind of see a slight, very vague sort of influence there from Rembrandt with his colours and so forth. But anyway, it is a landscape. It's entirely out of my head. There is, you probably can't see it so well, but that's a church there, there's a waterfall, there's a bit of a house there, believe it or not, and some houses up there, and there's a hay cart and a horse and a man, all that there. So it's a bit of a landscape from my mindscape, I guess. And there you go. Anyway, this week, who am I going to talk about? Well, it is in fact Vitus Bering. The man who a lot of people probably think is Russian, but in fact was Danish, whose accomplishments during his life was largely overlooked by the Russians for various reasons. However, in 1991 his corpse was dug up and examined, and then they created a statue of his likeness from that on Bering Island, and in actual fact he was given a new statue and given full honours for his accomplishments, which indeed were rather spectacular, really, considering when he did it, I think, and the fact that he covered such huge distances. So anyway, he was born in Denmark in 1681, and at the time Tsar Peter the Great of Russia wanted to create a Russian navy. See, so he thought that the best way would be if he dressed up as a carpenter and worked in Netherlands, Peter the Great, and from that way he could learn all about naval architecture and how to develop a navy. So he did that, and he came to the conclusion whilst there that in actual fact the best way was to recruit English, Dutch or Danish naval officers rather than to teach the Russians from scratch. So Vitus Bering was at a nautical school in the Netherlands, and he was in fact spotted by a naval officer from Russia, and he was recruited by them. And his first incredible act of bravado was in a bit of a scrap between the Russians and the Turks when he ran a ship, a Russian ship, under the Turkish guns and miraculously saved the ship. So from that feat of pretty fantastic commandeering of the ship, he was given an expedition. The Russians at the time wanted to discover the northwest of Russia, Siberia, Kamchatka, and see if there's any land bridge between Asia and America. So he was given that, an expedition to discover just those places, and they headed off. And at the time, that expedition became the longest running expedition over the longest stretch of land ever in the annals of history, because it took them 3 years just to reach Siberia. And yes, they eventually come to Kamchatka, and for those of you who are familiar with the game Risk will know Kamchatka. Yeah, got to Kamchatka, and the locals were really interesting. They apparently twins were known as bad luck because they had a very superstitious kind of life. They were in fact what he called evil people led by sorcerers. Well, I don't know if they're all evil, but they practice evil. And yeah, twins were considered bad luck, so therefore one of them was killed at birth, and they didn't bury their deceased. They would throw them into the forest to be devoured by wild animals. Boy, what an interesting time. So he couldn't wait to get out of there, and he said, "Alright, let's go." And he rolled the dice again, and they said, "Right, that way." And ended up at the Arctic Sea. Proved that there was in fact no land bridge there at all. So he said, "Stuff it all, let's go home." And they headed back to Kamchatka. Eventually they got back to Russia in 1730, and they got a cold reception. And he said, "Not more of this. I've been freezing for months and months and years now. This is terrible." And I don't know, they just weren't that sort of pleased with it all. I think it was half by because he wasn't Russian or something. But anyway, in 1733, 3 years later, he set off again. But this time he was leading the expedition. But because he wasn't Russian, I think he was made as a subordinate to the Russian officers and all the scientists and everyone. And the whole expedition was a bit of a nightmare for them because the scientists had all these dozens of carts of everything, of entire wine cellars and so forth, and they were very bossy and rude to him and everything. He couldn't do anything about it. But anyway, eventually they got to Alaska, and they became the first men to touch down on Kayak Island, and who lived to tell the tale. A bit of a wild place there as well. He met the Aleuts, who were, I think, Eskimos, Inuits or something, and who they rowed out to meet him in skin boats. And they said, by golly, if you're not quick enough, this might be your skin. No, I don't know if they said that, but they did ride out to see him in skin boats. And they couldn't stay long, however. They were a bit nervous. And so they headed back to Kamchatka again. And on the way back, though, they were hit by this massive storm. Lots of men died of scurvy. I think one of the scientists on the expedition was just working things out about how to cure scurvy, but they weren't quite onto it then. But anyway, they ended up on the Commander Islands because the men were so many men were dying of scurvy, and the men were so weak that they couldn't climb the rigging to set the sails and all that. So they ended up washed on these Commander Islands, and there was no wood, right? Little shelter, so they made some lean-tos on the beach, on the sort of frozen sand on the beach. And the men were dying so much, they were so weak that they were having to lie amongst the dead, really, because they couldn't drag them away. And there were foxes coming up, and they were snapping the toes and the fingers off the dead. So a bit of a horrendous time, really, and unfortunately this is where the heroic figure of Vitus Bering passed away, and he was buried on the island. Eventually the survivors finally got back to Russia to find that they were assumed dead, you see, and so all their possessions had been given away. Their accomplishments were largely lost because at that time Russia was ruled by the Empress Elizabeth, who was fairly xenophobic, and of course being led by someone who wasn't Russian. Yes, his accomplishments weren't really given the esteem that they should have been. So it wasn't until 1991, like I said at the beginning, that Danish and Russian scientists got together and they dug Vitus Bering up, and they had a look at his stature and that, because it had been portrayed as a sort of a weedy little man. He was actually like had the stature of a sort of a bodybuilder, even though he was in his 60s or something when he died. And so they created a liking of him in a statue, and they gave him full honours for his accomplishments for his adopted country, Russia. He was in fact a magnificent explorer at a time when they didn't know much about scurvy, and if you can imagine, they didn't have half the technology we have now for travelling in such adverse, extreme conditions. So I think it was quite admirable. Good on you, Vitus. Well done. Anyway, that's this week's painting. That's this week's story. I hope you have a fantastic week. I'm not so regular now with the old videos because I'm drawing heaps. In fact, that's why I'm not painting anything new. I'm drawing heaps. But so I haven't quite got the time. But anyway, I enjoy making the videos. Thank you very much if you've subscribed recently. Thank you for your comments, ratings, everything else. Keep it up, and I'll see you again for the next video. Good on you. Cheers. Bye.